You got a lot of nerve. Still breathing my air. Harlem grew up while you were gone, old man. It doesn't need a babysitter anymore.
What the hell did you?
Harlem, 1961. A mob boss walked up to Bumpy Johnson and spat directly on his shoes, in public, in front of 9 witnesses. Bumpy didn't move, just called the shoeshine boy over and kept reading his newspaper. So how did a man sitting quietly in a barbershop chair bring a 5 families enforcer to his knees? Without ever standing up? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. Harlem in July 1961 was not a place that whispered. It screamed, through open fire hydrants flooding the gutters, through the blare of car horns on Lenox Avenue, through the voices of men arguing on stoops and women calling down from windows 4 floors up. The heat pressed against everything like a hand that refused to let go, and the air smelled of fried food, hot asphalt, and something harder to name. Something that had been building for years and was only now beginning to find its shape. The civil rights movement had cracked the country open like an egg. Sit-ins, freedom riders, names of cities that people had never heard of were now on every front page. The country was changing, or trying to, and Harlem, as it always had, was watching the rest of America catch up to what black men and women had already known for generations. But beneath the streets that the newspapers wrote about, beneath the marches and the speeches and the photographs of fire hoses turned on crowds, there was another world entirely. A world with its own laws, its own borders, its own justice. And for the past 3 years, while one of its most essential figures had been absent, that world had begun to tilt on its axis in ways that no march and no speech could fix. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stepped out of a yellow cab on the corner of 116th Street and 7th Avenue at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. He carried one bag. He wore a charcoal gray suit despite the heat, a white shirt buttoned to the collar, and a pair of brown leather shoes, polished to a shine so deep you could see the sky in them if you looked close enough. He paid the driver, did not wait for change, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk looking up at the block he had not seen in 3 years. Nobody called him Ellsworth. Nobody ever had. Harlem called him Bumpy. He did not make a scene of his return. There was no convoy, no escort, no crowd gathered to welcome him back. That was not his way. He had never needed noise to announce himself. The way a room changed when he entered it, the way spines straightened and voices dropped and eyes tracked him without being caught doing it, that was announcement enough. He had learned long ago that real power never announces itself. It simply arrives, and then it is simply there, the way gravity is there, and you understand it not because someone explained it to you, but because you feel its pull in your bones. He was 53 years old. His temples had gone gray in Alcatraz, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, and there was something in the set of his jaw that had not been there before. A quality of absolute stillness that men who have spent long years in confined spaces sometimes acquire, as though the body has learned to take up less space in the world so that the mind can take up more. But the eyes were the same as they had always been. Dark, precise, missing nothing. He picked up his bag and walked to the barbershop. The place belonged to a man named Clarence Odom, who had run it for 22 years and who understood, as every good barber does, that his shop was not merely a place where hair was cut. It was a confessional, a courthouse, a newspaper. Information moved through Clarence's shop the way blood moves through a body. And Bumpy had always used it the same way a doctor uses a stethoscope. To listen to what was happening underneath the surface, to hear whether the pulse was steady or racing, to diagnose what no one was willing to say out loud. Clarence looked up when the door opened. For 1 full second he did not move. Then he set down his scissors, crossed the room in 4 steps, and grabbed Bumpy's hand with both of his own. "Lord have mercy," Clarence said quietly. "You're back. Seems that way," Bumpy said. He settled into the chair nearest the window. Not the barber's chair, but the waiting chair, the one with the cracked vinyl armrest he had sat in 100 times before, and he opened the newspaper he had bought from the stand on the corner. He did not ask Clarence anything. He did not need to. He simply sat and read and let Harlem come to him. It came within minutes. A man named Gerald, who ran the dry goods store 2 blocks over, stopped in on the pretense of needing a trim. and spent 6 minutes talking about how the rent on his building had gone up 40% since the previous spring, and how the man collecting it was someone he had never seen before the year prior. A woman named Sister Pauline, who organized the church auxiliary 3 streets away, stopped to say hello and mentioned in passing that 2 of the young men from her congregation had lost their jobs at the loading dock after refusing to kick back a portion of their weekly pay to someone whose name she either did not know or was not willing to say. A police officer named Dawson, who Bumpy had known since Dawson was a rookie walking a beat in a uniform 2 sizes too large, came in for no reason at all, shook Bumpy's hand, and looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts relief and warning before walking back out without a word. 7 people in 30 minutes, each one carrying a piece of the same picture. Bumpy turned the pages of his newspaper and assembled the picture in his mind without appearing to think about it at all. Something had moved into Harlem while he was gone. Something that was collecting what did not belong to it, pressing on people who had no leverage to push back, and doing so with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from believing, genuinely believing, that there is nobody around who will object. It had settled in the way a stone settles at the bottom of a clear stream, heavy, unmoving, and counting on the current to flow around it rather than dislodge it. Bumpy's jaw tightened by a fraction so small that only someone who had known his face for decades would have noticed. Then it relaxed. He turned another page. The morning moved on. The shop filled with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary day. The snip of scissors, the low murmur of men talking, the radio in the back playing something slow and brass heavy that floated through the room like smoke. Bumpy sat and read and said very little, and the people who came and went looked at him the way people look at something they had half convinced themselves they would never see again, and are not yet entirely certain they are not imagining. He was on the 3rd section of the paper, the financial pages, which he read with the same methodical attention he gave everything, when the door opened again. The sound that came with it was different from every other time the door had opened that morning. There was a quality to it, a widening of the ordinary noise of the street, that Bumpy registered before he looked up. Not louder, just broader. The sound of more than one person arriving with the specific purpose of being noticed. He looked up. 4 men came through first. They were big in the way that men who are hired to be big are big. Not the size of men who have labored at something their whole lives, but the size of men who maintain themselves as instruments. They wore short-sleeved shirts despite their attempts at presentation, and their eyes moved across the room with the flat professional sweep of men, cataloging exits and potential complications. They fanned out on either side of the entrance with the unconscious choreography of a group that has done this many times before. The 5th man came in last. He was 42 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have spent their lives acquiring and protecting things tend to look older. As though the weight of what they own has pressed years into their faces that calendar time alone could not account for. He was not large. He was medium height, medium build, with dark hair, slicked back from a face that was handsome, in a way that had probably once served him well, and now served mainly as a surface onto which his confidence was projected. He wore a pale linen suit and a shirt open at the collar, and he had a cigar between his teeth that he was not so much smoking as wearing, the way certain expensive watches, not to tell the time, but to tell you something about themselves. His name was Carmine Sella. Bumpy knew the name. He had known it before he walked through the door that morning, had known it as one of the pieces of information that had filtered back to him even inside Alcatraz through channels that the Federal Bureau of Prisons would have found interesting to learn about. Sella was connected, modestly, in the grand architecture of the 5 families, but in the specific geography of what he had been assigned to manage, his connection was sufficient. He had been sent to Harlem 3 years ago, and he had made himself comfortable there in the way that men who are given a temporary assignment sometimes make themselves too comfortable, mistaking the absence of resistance for the absence of consequence. For 3 years, there had been no consequence. Sella came through the door of Clarence's barbershop, the way he came through every door in Harlem, as though he had already decided what the room contained and had made his assessment of its value before crossing the threshold. His eyes moved around the space with the bored efficiency of a landlord doing a routine inspection, and the four men behind him took their positions, and the ordinary life of the barbershop simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with protest. It simply stopped the way a record stops when the needle is lifted, a silence that contains within it the echo of everything that had been playing. Two men waiting for haircuts found reasons to stand up and leave. Clarence set his scissors down on the counter and turned toward the door with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has learned that expressions cost money. The young man who swept the floors retreated to the back room. Only Tommy, the shoeshine boy, 22 years old, but carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone older still, who had worked the corner of the shop for 2 years, stayed where he was, folded into his small chair in the corner, because there was nowhere obvious for him to go, and because moving suddenly seemed more dangerous than stillness. Sella's eyes moved through the room. They passed over Clarence. They passed over Tommy. They found Bumpy. He stopped. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, exactly, because men like Sella rarely permit themselves the vulnerability of surprise in front of witnesses. It was more like a recalibration. A moment of processing followed immediately by a decision. And the decision clearly was this, that whatever this moment was, it was an opportunity. That the man sitting in the chair by the window with a newspaper in his lap, the man who had just spent 3 years on a rock in San Francisco Bay, was not a threat. He was a prop, and this moment, if handled correctly, was a performance. The slow smile came then. It started at one corner of his mouth and spread without ever reaching his eyes. He crossed the room. He walked with deliberate ease, hands loose at his sides, cigar tilted upward in his teeth, and he came to stand directly in front of Bumpy Johnson, with perhaps 2 feet of charged air between them. He looked down, first at Bumpy's face, then, slowly at the shoes, the brown leather shoes, polished to that deep mirror shine, sitting on the linoleum floor of Clarence Odom's barbershop on 1 and 16th Street. The entire room had contracted to the size of those 2 feet of air. Nobody breathed. Sella looked back up, held Bumpy's gaze for a long moment, and then, with the full and deliberate leisure of a man who believes absolutely in his own impunity, he bent his chin toward his chest, gathered, and spat directly onto the left shoe. The sound of it was almost nothing. A small, wet impact, barely audible. It was the loudest thing that had happened in that room in years. Tommy made a sound that he immediately swallowed. Clarence's hand gripped the edge of the counter. The 4 men at the door were still as furniture. The cigar smoke drifted up and flattened against the ceiling. Bumpy looked down at his shoe. He looked at it for 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Long enough that the silence began to acquire a texture, thick, trembling. The silence of a room full of people who are holding in their chests something very large and very dangerous. Then he looked up at Carmine Sella. His face had not changed, not a single line of it. The set of his jaw was exactly what it had been before the man walked through the door. His eyes, dark, precise, measuring, regarded Sella with an expression that was not anger, and not contempt, and not fear, and not anything that Sella, in his preparations for this moment, had anticipated. It was patience, the absolute, bottomless patience of a man who has already decided how this ends. Sella took the cigar from his teeth, exhaled a long breath of smoke that moved across the space between them, and said, "Harlem grew up while you were gone, old man. It doesn't need a babysitter anymore." His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man making a reasonable point. Bumpy held his gaze for 1 more second, 2. Then he looked across the room, past Sella's shoulder, to the corner where Tommy sat rigid and pale in his small chair. "Tommy," Bumpy said. His voice was perfectly level. "Come clean this up for me." Tommy was on his feet before the sentence was finished. He crossed the room with his kit and knelt on the floor in front of Bumpy's chair, and his hands were shaking, but he kept his head down and did what he had been asked to do. The only sound in the shop was the soft movement of cloth against leather. Bumpy opened his newspaper, found his place on the financial page, continued reading. Sella stood there for a moment, cigar in hand, smile still arranged on his face, but something behind it shifting now, recalculating, trying to determine what it was he was looking at and why the response he had prepared for had not materialized. Then he turned, said something to one of his men in a low voice that made two of them laugh, and walked back out through the door with the same deliberate ease with which he had come in, and his four men followed, and the doors swung shut behind them. The street noise came back. Nobody in the shop spoke for a very long time. Tommy finished polishing the shoe. He sat back on his heels and looked up at Bumpy with an expression that was a question he did not know how to form into words. Bumpy turned a page of his newspaper. Clarence, from behind the counter, found his voice first. It came out quieter than usual, stripped of its ordinary warmth. "Bumpy, a pause, you all right?" Bumpy did not look up from the page. "I'm reading a very good article, Clarence," he said. "Don't interrupt me." His voice was the same as it always had been. Calm, measured, faintly amused the way a man is amused by something only he can see clearly. He turned another page, and in the particular quality of that stillness, in the absolute refusal of his face and his body and his voice, to give Carmine Sella a something he had come looking for, something had already begun. Not visibly, not with noise or motion or any of the signals by which ordinary men announce that something is happening, but the machine had started moving, quietly, precisely, with the terrible patience of a mind that never acts before it is ready and is never not ready. The smartest man in the room is never the one who talks the most. And that night, Bumpy Johnson did not say a word to anyone, but from the moment Tommy knelt down to polish that shoe, this machine had already begun to move. The sun had dropped behind the rooftops by the time Bumpy Johnson walked back to his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the building they called Sugar Hill, where Harlem's finest had always lived, where Duke Ellington had kept rooms and W. E.B. Du Bois had walked the same hallways. He took the stairs slowly, not from age or fatigue, but from habit. He had always thought better on the stairs, something about the measured rhythm of ascending, one step at a time, that organized the mind the way a metronome organizes music. He unlocked the door, went inside, did not turn on the lights immediately. He stood at the window for a long moment, looking down at the avenue below. The last of the evening foot traffic, the orange glow of street lamps beginning to assert themselves against the fading sky. A group of young men on the corner doing what young men on corners do, which is mainly wait for something to happen while pretending they are not waiting. Harlem at dusk, the hour when the city shifted registers, when the day people went inside and the night people began to emerge, when the ordinary and the otherwise traded places on the same streets. Bumpy watched it for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he went to the telephone and made 3 calls. Each one was brief. Each one said only a time and nothing else. The time was 11 o'clock that night. The place was understood without being spoken because it was always the same place. The back room of a jazz club on 133rd Street called the Velvet Rail, which had been closed to the public for renovations for the past 2 weeks, and which would remain closed until Bumpy decided renovations were complete. He made himself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened a composition notebook, the same kind he had used since he was a boy in Georgia's, a black and white marbled cover, college-ruled lines, and began to write. Not plans, not yet. First, facts. He wrote down everything he had heard that morning at Clarence's shop, everything that 7 people in 30 minutes had told him without meaning to tell him, and he organized it the way a surgeon organizes instruments before an operation. By function, by sequence, by what each piece of information made possible. He wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When he was done, he read it back, made 2 small corrections, closed the notebook, then he dressed, put on his hat, and went out into the Harlem night. The back room of the Velvet Rail smelled of old cigarette smoke and lemon oil, and the particular stillness of a space that has been deliberately emptied. 3 folding chairs had been arranged around a card table under a single hanging lamp, and the 3 people sitting in those chairs when Bumpy arrived looked up with the focused attention of people who have learned that being called at short notice means the subject is not a small one. Moses Tate was 68 years old and had been a practicing attorney for 35 years before a disagreement with the New York Bar Association over certain client relationships had retired him from official practice. He was thin, precise, and possessed of a memory so exact that he was known to quote from documents he had not read in a decade without missing a word. He had advised Bumpy for 20 years and had never once given him advice designed to make Bumpy feel good rather than to make Bumpy think clearly. That was his value. Luther Reeves sat beside him, broad-shouldered, 37 years old, a man of very few words who chose each of those words the way a careful man selects a tool from a rack, for the specific job it needs to do and nothing else. Luther had been with Bumpy since he was 22. In 15 years, he had never asked a question before he was given all available information, never acted before he was given a direction, and never given a direction he had received to anyone who had not been cleared to receive it. He was, in the particular vocabulary of the world they inhabited, completely trustworthy. That was a rarer quality than it sounds. Gloria Sims sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded in front of her, dressed as though she had just come from a dinner party, which she had, in fact, having excused herself from a gathering of city councilmen and their wives in the East 70s to be here instead. She was 34, elegant in the specific way of women who have made elegance into a professional instrument, and she moved through the upper registers of New York society, both sides of the color line, which was itself a remarkable achievement for 1961, with a fluency that made her invaluable in ways that had nothing to do with what most people assumed when they saw her on the arm of important men at important events. She heard things, she remembered them, she knew which secrets belonged to whom and what those secrets were worth. It was, as in its own way, a form of architecture. Bumpy sat down. He placed the composition notebook on the table but did not open it. "Carmine Sella," he said. Moses nodded once, as though confirming a diagnosis he had already suspected. "I know the name," Gloria said. "He came to a benefit for the mayor's re-election campaign in March, made a donation that was large enough to get him a photograph with the mayor and small enough not to attract federal attention. He was with a woman who was not his wife and a man I did not recognize." "The man you didn't recognize," Bumpy said, "was probably Angelo Ricci. He goes everywhere. Sella goes that Sella doesn't want to appear to be anywhere significant." "Then Ricci was there," Gloria said, "which means someone in the mayor's office has a relationship with people downtown that the mayor himself would prefer not to know about." "That's useful," Bumpy said. "Hold on to it." He opened the notebook, spread the map he had folded into the back cover, a detailed street map of Harlem with 9 locations marked in pencil, and placed it in the center of the table where all 3 of them could see it. "Sella is not the problem," he said. "Sella is a symptom. The problem is Don Enzo Ferrara, who sent him here 3 years ago and has been collecting out of Harlem through him ever since. I can remove Sella from this board tomorrow if I want to. But if I remove Sella without making Ferrara decide to remove him, another one comes. Maybe 2, maybe someone less stupid." He paused. "Sella being stupid is actually useful. I want to keep his replacement from being smarter." Moses leaned forward. "So the objective is not to defeat Sella. The objective is to make Ferrara conclude that Sella is a liability he cannot afford to keep." "That's the objective," Bumpy said. 3 layers, Moses said. It was not a question. 3 layers, Bumpy confirmed. Money first, then daylight, then the conversation that makes daylight unnecessary. Luther had not spoken yet. He looked at the map, traced one of the pencil-marked routes with his eyes, and said, "Timeline?" 72 hours for the first layer, Bumpy said. The second layer runs concurrent starting at 48 hours. The third layer happens when the first 2 have done enough damage that the conversation becomes the easier option rather than the braver one. Luther nodded. That was sufficient for him. Bumpy looked at each of them in turn, Moses, Luther, Gloria, with the particular quality of attention that those who knew him well recognized as his way of making an assessment final. Not asking whether they were willing. That had never been the question with these 3. Assessing whether they understood completely, whether there were gaps in the understanding that needed to be filled before execution began. He saw no gaps. "One thing," he said, and his voice changed register slightly, not louder but more specific, the way a man's voice changes when he is about to say the thing that matters most. Nothing that puts anyone in a cell. Nothing that gives anyone in a uniform a reason to look at us instead of them. We win this in the open, in the light, using every tool they don't think we have. He closed the notebook. They spit on the wrong man today. But they're going to figure that out through their bank accounts and their newspapers, not through anything else. The three of them exchanged no glances with each other. They simply absorbed what they had been told, made it part of their operational understanding, and prepared to act on it. "There's one more thing," Gloria said quietly. "About this morning, what Sella did." She paused. "People in Harlem are going to hear about it. They probably already have. Some of them are going to be watching to see what happens." Bumpy looked at her steadily. "Good," he said. "Let them watch." He stood, picked up the notebook, and folded the map back into the cover with the same neat precision with which he did everything. 72 hours, he said, and walked out through the back into the Harlem night. The first layer took 61 hours. It came in 11 hours as under schedule, which was typical of Luther Reeves, who had a deep personal aversion to waste of any kind, including wasted time. The mechanism was straightforward in concept and intricate in execution. Sella's operation in Harlem was sustained by a network of financial dependencies, men and women who owed him money, or who paid him a percentage of what they earned, or who operated under arrangements that had been negotiated under conditions of limited choice. These arrangements generated the revenue that justified Sella's continued presence to Don Ferrara downtown, who was, at his essential core, a businessman who measured the value of any asset by what it returned. Bumpy and Luther went to see these people one at a time. Not together, separately, at different hours, in different parts of the neighborhood, with no pattern that could be observed and reported. Each conversation was different in its particulars and identical in its structure. Bumpy sitting across from someone, speaking quietly, and placing before them an alternative that was better in every measurable way than the arrangement they were currently living under. Debs retired, percentages reduced to zero. The weight of 3 years of accumulation simply lifted and set aside. He did not ask for loyalty in return. He asked only for one thing, that the financial relationship with Carmine Sella be considered concluded. By the morning of the third day, 11 of Sella's 14 revenue sources in Harlem had quietly redirected. The remaining 3 were not worth the trouble of pursuing. The mathematics were straightforward and merciless. Sella's weekly take from Harlem, which had been providing a comfortable margin for Don Ferrara's accounting, had collapsed to something close to nothing. Sella noticed at the 40-hour mark. Luther had sources who reported that he had made 7 phone calls in 2 hours, summoned 3 of his men to a meeting that lasted 90 minutes, and spent considerable energy attempting to identify what had happened and who had orchestrated it. He arrived at no useful conclusions, because the conversations that had produced the outcome had been private, quiet, and conducted by a man whose return to Harlem many people were choosing not to advertise to anyone connected to Carmine Sella. This was the first kind of pain. Financial, concrete, the kind that shows up in numbers and cannot be argued with. The second layer had already been in motion for 24 hours by then, operating on a different frequency entirely. Gloria Sims had attended 3 social events in 48 hours, a reception for a visiting alderman in Brooklyn, a private dinner in the West Village hosted by a publisher whose roster included 2 journalists at major New York papers, and a cocktail gathering in a Sutton Place penthouse where the guest list included, among others, a senior editor at the New York Amsterdam News. She had moved through each of these events with her customary ease, speaking to the people she needed to speak to, saying very little that was direct and a great deal that was precisely calibrated, and leaving behind her a set of ideas that she had not appeared to introduce, but which were now living in other people's minds as though they had always been there. The idea was simple because the truth was simple. Somewhere, in Harlem, a man connected to organized crime interest from downtown Manhattan, was collecting money from black small business owners, black workers, black families, and had been doing so for 3 years, unimpeded, while the civil rights movement had been demanding on the floor of Congress and in the streets of a dozen cities that black Americans be treated as full citizens, deserving of protection and dignity under the law. The story wrote itself. Gloria had not needed to write it. She had only needed to make sure that the people whose job it was to write such things were aware that the story existed and where to find the edges of it. The Harlem Gazette ran the first piece on a Thursday morning. It was careful. No names, no direct accusations, the scrupulous hedging of a publication that understands the legal terrain of what it is doing. But it was clear enough that anyone in Harlem who had experienced the reality being described would recognize it immediately, and clear enough that anyone in the offices of the 5 families who read it would understand was being with cold certainty that a direction they did not want spotlights. They did not want spotlights moved. The New York-Amsterdam News ran a longer piece 2 days later, with slightly less hedging, and one specific reference to the involvement of organized interests with connections to established criminal networks in Lower Manhattan. The piece coincided with a moment in national attention when the phrase organized interests with connections to established criminal networks was about as welcome in the public conversation as a lit match in a room full of dry timber. Phone calls were made in offices that were not in Harlem. Voices were raised. Questions were asked, specifically by people who had previously asked no questions about Carmine Sella's operations in Harlem, about how a situation had been allowed to develop that was now generating the precise kind of public attention that everyone involved had the most urgent reasons to avoid. Sella, when he heard about the articles, reportedly threw a glass against a wall. Then he made the error of attempting to identify the source and discourage further coverage through methods that were blunt and direct, and that, in the current atmosphere, produced the opposite of the intended effect. 2 journalists who had not previously been aware of the story became aware of it. A city councilman who represented a portion of Harlem and who was positioning himself for a larger race issued a statement calling for an investigation. The spotlight was no longer moving. It had arrived. This was the second kind of pain. Public, radiating outward, the kind that cannot be contained once it begins. Don Enzo Ferrara, who was 61 years old and had survived in his position for 23 years by developing an almost physical sensitivity to the difference between problems that could be managed quietly and problems that could not, sat in his office in Lower Manhattan on a Friday afternoon and looked at the 2 newspaper articles that his attorney had placed in front of him. He read them once. Then he read them again. Then he asked his attorney a single question: whether the timing of these articles and the sudden evaporation of revenue from Harlem bore any relationship to the return of a particular individual from federal custody. His attorney was a careful man. He said he could not confirm that with certainty. Ferrara looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Find out if Bumpy Johnson has asked for a meeting with anyone I know." The answer to that question was already on its way. Bumpy had requested the meeting through a channel that Don Ferrara could not publicly acknowledge and could not conveniently ignore. A channel that ran through Angelo Ricci, which was the only channel that mattered, because Angelo Ricci was the only person in the entire architecture of the 5 families who could carry information to Ferrara and deliver an honest response back without either distorting the message or burying it for political reasons. The meeting took place at a small restaurant in the Bronx, a neighborhood restaurant, not a known establishment, the kind of place with 4 tables and a handwritten menu that is used specifically because it appears on no list of places associated with anyone significant. It was 10:30 at night. The street outside was quiet. The owner had been asked to close early and had complied without asking why. Bumpy arrived alone. He had told Luther he would be going alone, and Luther had said nothing but had looked at him with an expression that communicated both understanding and a very specific form of concern, and Bumpy had put on his jacket and gone. Ricci was already seated when Bumpy came in. He was a compact man in his early 50s with silver hair cut close to the skull and the watchful, assessing eyes of someone who has spent a career at the intersection of people who do not trust each other. He had a glass of water in front of him and nothing else. He looked at Bumpy when he sat down, looked at him carefully, the way you look at something you have heard described many times and are now measuring against the description. "You came alone," Ricci said. "I did," Bumpy said. A pause. "You're not worried." Bumpy settled back in his chair with the ease of a man sitting in his own kitchen. "I spent 3 years in Alcatraz, Mr. Ricci. I've thought about this question a great deal. I concluded that if there is something worse than Alcatraz, I haven't encountered it yet, and I suspect I won't tonight." Ricci studied him for another moment. Then something in his face adjusted, not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional acknowledgement. He picked up his water glass and said nothing further on the subject. Bumpy reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. He placed it on the table between them, not sliding it across, not pushing it, simply placing it there with the deliberate neutrality of a man setting down a document rather than making a threat. Inside that envelope, he said, is a detailed accounting of the financial damage that Mr. Sella's operation in Harlem has caused to the long-standing and mutually productive relationship between certain business interests in this city. The accounting was prepared by a former attorney who still has his faculties, even if he no longer has his license. Every figure is accurate. Every figure is verifiable. Ricci did not immediately reach for the envelope. The revenue numbers have changed, Ricci said carefully. It was not a question. They have, Bumpy said. Significantly. That is also documented inside. A silence settled over the table. Outside, somewhere on the Bronx Street, a car passed slowly and its headlights swept briefly across the restaurant window and moved on. There are also other factors, Bumpy said. Factors of a public nature that I think Don Ferrara is already aware of. I won't insult either of us by elaborating. Ricci picked up the envelope. He did not open it. Simply held it, feeling the weight of it, which was the weight of numbers, organized into an argument that had no effective counter-argument. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, just enough to indicate that what came next was the central thing. Mr. Ricci, he said, and his voice was the same voice it always was, level, unhurried, with that quality of absolute precision that made every word land exactly where it was aimed. I want no war. I have never wanted war. War is expensive for everyone and profitable for no one except people who sell ammunition. What I want is very simple. I want Don Ferrara to understand that the person he sent to Harlem 3 years ago has cost both of us more than he has produced. In money, in reputation, and in the kind of attention that neither of us needs or wants in the current environment. He paused. I want Don Ferrara to reach his own conclusion about what the appropriate response to that information is. I am confident he will reach the right one. He is a man of considerable intelligence. Ricci looked at him across the table for a long moment. The silence was the kind that contains a great deal of active thinking. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. I'll deliver the message, he said. I know you will, Bumpy said. That's why I'm here and not somewhere else. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and picked up his hat from the table. One more thing, Ricci said, and his voice had shifted slightly. There was something in it now that was closer to genuine curiosity than anything professional. This morning, in the barbershop, what Sella did. He paused. You didn't react. Bumpy put on his hat and adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, a gesture so habitual it had become invisible. No, he said. I didn't. Ricci looked at him. Why not? Bumpy considered the question with the seriousness it was apparently due. Then he said, because the shoe could be cleaned, and everything else cannot be undone. He walked to the door, opened it. The night air of the Bronx came in, warm and smelling of summer and concrete. Good evening, Mr. Ricci, he said, and he was gone. At 9 o'clock the following morning, a phone rang in a building in Lower Manhattan. 12 minutes later, a different phone rang in Harlem, in the apartment where Carmine Sella had been living for the past 3 years, as though it were a permanent address rather than a temporary assignment. Sella answered it. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who called rarely, and whose calls, when they came, were brief and final. The voice said, Don Ferrara says you have embarrassed him. You have 6 hours. Take what is yours and leave what isn't. Sella said, What? What happened? Who? The line went dead. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. Then he began to move, urgently, erratically, the way a man moves when the ground has disappeared beneath him and he cannot yet locate where solid footing might be. He made calls that were not answered. He sent men to addresses where the doors did not open. He went down to the street and tried to find the ordinary reassurances of the world he had spent 3 years constructing. The faces that showed him deference, the corners that acknowledged him, the small daily recognitions that had told him every morning that this was his territory and he was its authority. None of it was there. The faces that had shown him deference showed him nothing now, or worse, showed him the specific blankness of people who have made a decision and are not going to be persuaded to revisit it. The corners did not acknowledge him. The street moved around him like water moving around a stone, not with hostility, but with the complete and final indifference of something that has simply reorganized itself and moved on. He found himself standing on 116th Street. He did not plan to be there. His feet had taken him there through some logic he could not have articulated, some pull toward the place where it had all begun. Or rather, the place where he now understood with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, it had all ended. He stood on the sidewalk outside Clarence Odom's barbershop and looked through the window. Bumpy Johnson was in the chair by the window, the same chair, the same newspaper in his lap, the same quality of absolute stillness, as though he had not moved since yesterday morning, as though the entire machinery of the past 72 hours had operated around him while he sat and read and waited for the world to arrange itself correctly. Their eyes met through the glass. Bumpy did not look away. He did not smile. He did not raise his chin or tilt his head or make any of the small gestures by which men in their world customarily signal victory over a defeated opponent. He simply looked at Carmine Sella through the window of the barbershop with an expression of complete and total tranquility. The tranquility of a man who has never for a single moment doubted how this would end. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. To Carmine Sella, it lasted considerably longer. He turned away from the window, walked back to his car, did not look back. By the time the sun touched the tops of the buildings on the western edge of Harlem, by the time the light went gold and long and the shadows stretched out across the avenue, and the day began its slow surrender to the evening, Carmine Sella's car had crossed the bridge and disappeared into downtown Manhattan. He left Harlem before sunset, exactly as the shoes had promised he would. Sella left Harlem with an empty suitcase and the expression of a man who had just understood that he had been losing since the day he thought he was winning. But the cruelest part had not yet arrived. The cruelest part was what Bumpy Johnson said to Tommy, the shoeshine boy, in the quiet of the barbershop right after. The barbershop was quiet in the way that places are quiet after something significant has passed through them. Not empty, but settled. The way a river settles after a stone has been thrown into it, and the rings have moved outward, and the surface has returned to itself. Clarence was sweeping the floor with the slow, meditative strokes of a man who sweeps not because the floor needs it, but because the motion helps him think. The radio in the back was playing something by Miles Davis. Muted trumpet, spare and cool, the kind of music that does not fill silence so much as give it a shape. Bumpy had not moved from the chair by the window. He had watched Sella's back disappear down 116th Street with the same expression he had worn through all of it, through the morning and the evening and the 72 hours between, which was no particular expression at all. Just the face of a man who has seen a thing through to its conclusion and is now returning his attention to the ordinary world that has been waiting patiently for him to finish. Tommy was still in his corner. He had been there all afternoon, doing small tasks, polishing the stand, organizing his tins, working at the edges of the space with the careful industry of someone who wants to be useful and also wants very much not to be sent away. He was 22, though as Bumpy had noted before, 17 was a complicated number in Harlem in 1961. Some 17-year-olds were still boys. Tommy was not. He had the eyes of someone who had already learned that the world does not adjust itself to accommodate what you need it to be, and had decided to learn the world's actual shape rather than mourn the shape he had hoped for. Bumpy folded his newspaper, set it on the small table beside the chair. He looked across the room at Tommy and said, "Come here." Tommy came. He stood in front of Bumpy with his hands at his sides and his chin level. Not quite meeting Bumpy's eyes, but not avoiding them either, occupying the careful middle ground of a young man who has been taught that looking down is weakness and staring is disrespect, and the space between those two things requires constant, conscious navigation. Bumpy reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a fold of bills. He separated several from the fold and held them out. Tommy looked at the money, then at Bumpy. "Sir," he said, "all I did was clean the shoe." "I know what you did," Bumpy said. He kept the bills extended until Tommy took them. "That's exactly what I'm paying you for." Tommy looked at the money in his hand with an expression of genuine confusion. "I don't understand." Bumpy studied him for a moment. The way he studied everything, with that complete, unhurried attention that made people feel simultaneously seen and measured. Yesterday morning, Bumpy said, there were 9 people in this room when Sella walked through that door. 8 of them were grown men and women who have been navigating this world for decades. When that man did what he did, when the whole room went quiet and everyone was waiting to see what happened next, do you know what those 8 people did? Tommy considered it. They froze, he said. They froze, Bumpy confirmed, because they were waiting for someone else to determine what the moment meant. They were waiting to see which the current was running so they could decide which way to swim. He paused. But you didn't wait. When I called your name, you were already moving. You came across that room, and you knelt down, and you did what needed doing, in front of a man who had just made a very deliberate point of humiliating the person you were kneeling in front of that man's 4 associates, in front of everyone in this room who was watching to see what happened next. He let that sit for a moment. You want to tell me that's nothing? Tommy was quiet. Something was moving behind his eyes, the particular movement of a young mind encountering a frame it had not previously considered. I was scared, he said. It came out simply, without apology, which made it more valuable than if it had been delivered with either. I know you were, Bumpy said. Your hands were shaking. I felt it through the shoe. He looked at the boy steadily. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Any fool can be reckless. That costs nothing because it risks nothing that matters. Bravery is when your hands are shaking, and you do the thing anyway, because it is the right thing, and you understand that clearly even when everything around you is telling you to wait, to freeze, to look to someone else. He paused. That is the hardest thing in any room, and yesterday morning in this room you were the only one who did it. Tommy looked down at the bills in his hand, then back up. What happened to him? He asked. To the man who? He left, Bumpy said simply. Before sunset. Tommy absorbed this. His expression asked the question that his mouth didn't. Bumpy almost smiled. Not quite, but the lines around his eyes shifted in a way that carried the same information. How is a story for another time, he said, though what is sufficient for tonight? Clarence had stopped sweeping. He was leaning on the handle of his broom across the room with the expression of a man who has been wanting to ask something all day and has finally arrived at the moment where asking is possible. Bumpy, he said. His voice was careful, the way voices are careful when they are carrying weight. This morning, when stopped, reorganized. Why didn't you do anything? Right then, in the moment, a pause. Everyone in Harlem is going to be asking that question. Bumpy turned to look at him. He took his time with the answer not because he didn't know it, but because he wanted to give it correctly. There are answers that can be spoken quickly, and answers that require the right pace to land in the right place, and he had learned long ago to know the difference. Because that's exactly what he wanted, Bumpy said. Clarence waited. When a man does something like that, publicly, deliberately, in front of witnesses, he is not making a statement about you. He is making a statement about himself. And he needs you to respond in a specific way to complete it. He needs you to react, to lose your composure, to make the moment about emotion rather than intelligence. Bumpy's voice was the same as it always was, level, measured, carrying within its steadiness something that was more forceful than volume. The moment I react, the moment I stand up and do what every instinct in that room was expecting me to do, I have handed him control of the situation. I have let him write the story. And the story he wanted to write was, here is a man who can be provoked. Here is a man whose emotions are accessible. Here is a man who can be managed. He paused. I did not come back to Harlem to be managed. Clarence nodded slowly. The broom handle turned between his palms. The shoe, Bumpy continued, can be cleaned. 5 minutes and it is as though nothing happened. But if I had lost my composure in that room, if I had given him the reaction he came here to collect, that cannot be undone. Not in 5 minutes, not in 5 years. Because people do not remember events. They remember what the events revealed about the people involved. He looked at Clarence directly. What did yesterday morning reveal about Carmine Sella? Clarence thought about it. That he needed to do that, he said slowly. That he needed to walk in here and do that to you in front of everyone. Yes, Bumpy said. A man who is genuinely secure in his position does not need to perform it. He does not need witnesses. He does not need to find the person who most represents what he wants to replace and degrade them publicly. He paused. He did that because he was afraid. Because somewhere underneath all of it, he understood that my coming back meant something, and he needed to answer that something before it answered him. He just answered it wrong. The Miles Davis record had ended. The room was very quiet now. The particular quiet of a place in which something true has been said and is still reverberating. Tommy, who had been listening with the absolute stillness of someone who knows they are hearing something they will carry with them for the rest of their life, said, "But what if you'd done nothing? What if you'd just let him, and nothing had happened after?" It was a serious question. Bumpy received it as one. "Then I would have done nothing," he said, "and something else would have become necessary." But the response to what he did was never going to be visible in that room, in that moment. The response was always going to happen somewhere else, in a way he didn't expect, on a timeline he couldn't track. He looked at the boy. That is the difference between a reaction and a decision. A reaction happens in the room, in the moment, on the other person's terms. A decision happens when you are ready on your terms, in the manner you choose. One of those gives you power. The other takes it from you. He stood. The movement was unhurried. The movement of a man rising from a chair because he is ready to rise, not because anything is pressing him. Clarence said, "People in Harlem are going to hear what happened today." "What Sella?" He stopped. "What happens to us, to this community, when word gets around that someone walked in here and did that?" Bumpy buttoned his jacket. His hands moved with the same precise economy they always did. "Word is already around," he said. "Harlem doesn't have secrets. It has delays." He picked up his hat from the side table and held it for a moment without putting it on. "What people are going to hear is that Carmine Sella came to Harlem, did what he did, and left before the sun went down. They will draw their own conclusions about what that sequence means." He looked at Clarence. "The dignity of this community is not something that one man can walk in here and remove. It is not stored in my shoes. It is not located in any single room or any single moment. It lives in what we do, in aggregate, over time, in whether we are still here, still standing, still conducting our lives on our own terms when people who thought they could rewrite our story have gone back to wherever they came from." He put on his hat, adjusted the brim. "Harlem has survived considerably worse than Carmine Sella," he said. "It will continue to survive. That is what Harlem does." He moved to the door. Clarence held it open, and for a moment the two men stood close together in the doorway. The older one, white-haired, holding a broom, and Bumpy with his hat set correctly on his head and his jacket buttoned against the evening air, and something passed between them that did not require words and did not receive any. Bumpy stepped out onto 116th Street. The evening had come fully now, the sky above Harlem a deep blue going darker at the edges, the street lamps burning steady gold, the avenue alive with the layered sound of a community in full motion. Voices, music from somewhere above, the percussion of a basketball on concrete, the high laughter of children who had stayed outside past when they were supposed to, the slow rumble of a city bus making its rounds. The smells of the evening rose from the storefronts and the food carts and the open windows of apartments where families were sitting down to dinner, garlic and frying oil and something sweet from the bakery on the corner that stayed open late. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in. Somewhere nearby, a woman was singing, not performing, just singing, the way people sing when they do not know or do not care that anyone can hear them. The pure and unself-conscious expression of something that needs to come out of the body because there is no longer room for it inside. The voice was low and full, and it moved through the warm evening air of Harlem the way certain voices move, not filling the space around them but deepening it. Bumpy looked down at his shoes. The brown leather caught the light of the nearest street lamp and returned it. A deep, warm gleam, the surface unbroken, no trace of the morning's events anywhere on them. Tommy had done good work. The shoes looked, if anything, better than they had when he had put them on that morning, buffed back to that mirror finish that had always been, for him, not vanity but a form of self-respect made visible. The statement that a man makes to the world simply by presenting himself as someone who has taken care of what is his. He thought about what Sella had seen when he looked at those shoes. He thought about what Sella had intended the gesture to mean, the hierarchy it was meant to establish, the diminishment it was supposed to achieve, the story it was supposed to tell about who held power over whom in this particular corner of the world. He thought about what it had actually meant. And then he stopped thinking about Carmine Sella, which was perhaps the most complete possible form of dismissal. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the kind of lingering attention that signals residual power, but simple and total divestment of interest, the way you stop thinking about a problem that has been solved. There is a particular freedom in that, in the setting down of something that has served its purpose and no longer requires carrying. He had set down heavier things than Carmine Sella over the course of his life, things with longer histories and deeper roots and greater weight, and he had learned that the setting down is always a choice, and that it is always available, and that most people do not make it because they have confused holding on with holding power, when the truth is usually the opposite. He began to walk, not in any particular hurry, the way a man walks when he is home, when the ground beneath him is ground he knows, and the air around him is air that knows him back, and the distance between where he is and where he is going is a pleasure rather than a transit. Harlem moved around him the way it always had, the way it had moved around him for 30 years. Through arrests and releases, through alliances and fractures, through absences and returns, through every version of himself that time and circumstance had required him to become. The community had its own memory, its own continuous life that did not depend on any individual, but that was shaped over time by the individuals who moved through it with sufficient force and sufficient care. He passed the dry goods store where Gerald was pulling down his security gate for the night. Gerald looked up and their eyes met, and Gerald raised one hand in a gesture that was simple and sufficient. Bumpy returned it and kept walking. He passed the church where Sister Pauline's congregation held its Sunday services, the building dark now but still carrying in its stone facade the particular gravity of a place where people bring the things they cannot carry alone. He passed the corner where the young men had been standing that morning when he arrived, empty now, the night having redistributed them, to wherever the night takes young men in Harlem in the summer of 1961. He passed the newsstand where he had bought his paper, the metal shutters closed, a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising tomorrow's editions. He walked, and Harlem held him the way a place holds a person who belongs to it, not gently, not softly, but with the full and complicated weight of everything the place is and has been and is still becoming. It was not an easy hold. It had never been an easy hold. But it was real, and it was his, and it was, as it had always been, sufficient. At the corner of 125th Street, he stopped and looked up. The sky above Manhattan had that quality it gets in summer evenings. Not quite dark, not quite light. A blue so deep it seems to have been dyed rather than fallen. The first few stars beginning to assert themselves against it like small, patient arguments for permanence. He thought of Tommy's hands, shaking on the leather of his shoe, doing the work anyway. He thought of Moses reading every figure in that envelope without once removing his glasses to rest his eyes. He thought of Gloria moving through a room full of people who underestimated her, leaving behind in each of them a seed that had grown in the direction she had calculated it would grow. He thought of Luther, who had said almost nothing across 3 days of precise and demanding work, because Luther understood that the value of what you do is not diminished by the absence of narration. He thought about what it means to build something, not a building, not a business, not an empire in the conventional sense, but a set of relationships, a web of trust and reciprocity and shared history that constitutes something larger than any of its individual elements. Something that persists, something that has its own tement, its own gravity, its own capacity to survive the pressures that are brought to bear against it. That is what Harlem had always been when it was at its best. Not a place defined by what it lacked, or what it had been denied, or what forces had been arrayed against it, but a place defined by what its people had built inside those conditions, what they had made of what they were given. The music, the culture, the commerce, the community, the specific and irreducible dignity of people who had decided, collectively and individually, that they would conduct their lives as though their lives mattered, because they did, and because the declaration of that fact, made daily and in every available register, was itself a form of power that no one standing outside could fully comprehend or permanently extinguish. Phẩm giá không phải là thứ người khác có thể lấy đi. He had said this to Clarence in English, but he thought it in the deeper language underneath language, the one that carries the things you have learned not from reading or reasoning, but from living, from being present for the full weight of your own existence, without flinching or looking away. Dignity is not something that can be taken. It is something that can only be surrendered, and the surrender is always a choice, made in a moment, under pressure, when everything in the immediate environment is suggesting that the cost of holding on is too high. That is when the choice is most visible. That is when it matters most. He had not surrendered it yesterday morning in Clarence's barbershop. He had not surrendered it in Alcatraz, across 3 different sentences that had collectively taken nearly a decade of his life. He had not surrendered it across 30 years of a life lived in the unlit spaces between what the law permits and what justice requires, navigating with imperfect instruments toward something that he had always known could not be fully reached, but that had also always been worth moving toward. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the familiar weight of nothing in particular, just the lining, worn smooth, the shape of a pocket that has been filled and emptied many times over many years. He thought about what it means to be a man who has outlasted what was meant to diminish him. Not triumphantly. Triumph is a posture, and postures are for people who need the external confirmation. Just quietly, just factually, he was still here. Harlem was still here. The shoes were clean. He turned up his collar against a breeze that had come off the river, small, warm, carrying with it the smell of summer moving slowly toward its end. And he walked on, into the evening, into the living and breathing and irreducible fact of the community that was his and that he was. Above him, the sky over Harlem deepened toward full dark. The stars came out one at a time, then all at once, and the city went on, as it always had, as it always would, on its terms, in its own voice, at its own pace. There are battles that need no gunfire. There are victories that need no celebration. And there are men whose presence alone, whose simple act of walking down a street they have always walked, unhurried, unbroken, with their shoes, catching the light of the lamps, is itself the most complete and eloquent answer to every question that was ever asked about what they are made of, and what they will and will not surrender, and how long they intend to remain. The answer in Bumpy Johnson's case was simple. As long as Harlem stood, he would be here.